screen starts glowing, and the film starts rolling. You wanna be knowing what you might be in for. So give the show a listen and find out what you're missing. Put yourself in position for the easy good score.
Hey listeners, welcome to the 191st episode of The Goods, a film podcast. Getting awful up there to pretty close to a 200, Brian. The countdown begins, and that's something that I am thankful for this Black Friday weekend that we are recording. How are you doing out there, Brian?
Yes, it's the weekend when we recognize Rebecca Black for inventing Friday.
I actually just watched that music video with my kids, and they didn't really understand why it was bad. Like, that's the thing. When you're a kid, you don't have any taste. And they're like, okay. But Katie and I were laughing really hard, me and my wife. So, throwback. And did you know she made a cover of it? She's still making music, but a few years ago. In like this sort of bizarre hyper pop new remix style. It's pretty intense. I'll send it your way. Maybe I'll post it on the Discord.
No, I missed that one, but one that my brother sends me every year is Arc Music also released a song called It's Thanksgiving, which features as well a cameo by producer Patrice Wilson in a turkey costume. So,
oh my gosh.
Part of the same series.
I think I've seen that one. The one that we quote is, I love Chinese food. Have you seen that one?
Also a classic.
At that point, he was leaning into being like intentionally cheesy, though. But it's still pretty great.
I use chopsticks to eat pot sticks, he says.
I went out for Chinese dinner with my wife last night, and later that evening, I hummed just one line from that song, from the chorus. I love Chinese food. Yeah. And one thing about my wife is, like, she's very prone to getting songs stuck in her head. So I knew I was doing something cruel when I did that. And sure enough, the next morning when we woke up, she said, I still have that stupid song stuck in my head. Just for me muttering one line of it the night before. But I apologize for that, Katie. If you're out there listening.
You're contagious.
I guess so.
Yeah, speaking of contagious... So Dan mentioned last week, I think, last time we sat down, that he was just getting over a cold, and I'm right in the thick of one right now. So luckily Dan hosts this week. I'm there for the color commentary, but if my voice sounds strange, that's why.
Stranger than normal, at least, yeah.
Right.
But we are here today to discuss a film, that film being Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. This is a 1987 comedy starring Steve Martin and John Candy, the late great. Written and directed by John Hughes. So there's kind of a lot to talk about here. A lot of context. What's the phrase we quote sometimes? Addicted to context.
Right. That's a Dan Carlin phrase.
So the first is, this is a Thanksgiving film. I think it's a Thanksgiving film in that it is set at Thanksgiving, and that thematically where it lands on, and even the premise to some extent, is bound by themes and traditions of Thanksgiving. So it's like a race to get back to family before Thanksgiving. And I feel like travel misadventures is a big part of the American Thanksgiving experience. And this is like the ultimate travel misadventures movie. And it also lands on kind of a warm, I'm grateful for this complex person in my life note that feels very Thanksgiving-y to me. We've been talking, I feel like every week we talk about what are the good Thanksgiving movies, Brian. Maybe I'm just thinking back to Pieces of April.
Yeah, this has been a Thanksgiving-heavy year because month through the calendar all wonky. But we've talked in the past that What do you watch when Thanksgiving comes around? There's not a lot of dedicated Thanksgiving films. I think this is probably the most well-known, most quote-unquote normie Thanksgiving film that we could have picked. But maybe we were due at some point.
I've been both on the Discord and in my own research, a lot of thought and a lot of discussion going into what are the Thanksgiving movies. Now, I think it was 2021 I did my deep dive of Thanksgiving movies, by which I mean I watched like 6 of them, can you even call it a deep dive? I don't know.
Hey, it's a deep dive if the pool is that shallow.
And it is relatively shallow as far as, I mean, especially compared to Christmas, of course, which is like a whole industrial complex, you know? There's 8 Christmas movies every year, so.
We must stop the Christmas industrial complex.
Was that a quote from something?
Well, I forget exactly how Eisenhower worded it, but he was the one to call out the military-industrial complex.
Oh, okay.
It was like in his farewell address. He's like, we got to do something about this, guys, and we haven't done anything about it. Also, he was one to talk. I mean, who embodies the military-industrial complex, if not the commander of the West?
Dwight D. Eisenhower, yeah. IndieWire is a movie website that I read, and they did an overview of Thanksgiving movies. They did a ranking of the best Thanksgiving movies recently. They pointed me to one that I was not familiar with. It's called Pilgrim, and it's a TV movie, or I guess a made-for-streaming movie. And this comes from Hulu. Hulu had a movie anthology series called After Dark, which was every episode was a movie, a new original movie in the horror genre centered around a holiday. And Pilgrim is apparently the name of the one that was Thanksgiving based. So I thought this was astonishing that there was this whole series of movies, this whole anthology that was just holiday-themed movies. Because I feel like we talk a decent amount, Brian, about how the calendar dictates our movie watching.
Right, quite often. And Pilgrim not to be confused with Puritan or Puritan 2.
Yeah, from Maxine. And also not to be confused with the horror movie Thanksgiving, which has a lot of pilgrim iconography in it, you know. But just to spend another minute here talking about this TV show.
And Eisenhower said we must guard against the military-industrial complex. That was his phrasing.
So yeah, this anthology of horror films was called Into the Dark, and they released 24 movies. Across 2 seasons, there was a couple of repeat holidays from season to season, but some of the holidays they looked at: Season 1, Halloween, Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's Eve, Valentine's Day, International Women's Day, the Ides of March, April Fool's Day, Mother's Day, Father's Day, Independence Day, First Day of School. Season 2, we had some repeats there. There's a Valentine's Day, St. Patrick's, Puka Day. Is that a real day?
Did you say Puka with a P?
Yeah.
Like Ireland?
An in-universe holiday started by a cult that mirrors the Easter miracle. Okay. I don't feel like that doesn't count if you make up your own holiday.
Yeah, that's a dodge. Also, I feel like they should have taken Halloween off the table.
Yeah, that's a shoo-in, you know? If you're going to do a holiday theme thing, you don't even need to do horror around Halloween. Literally, the most famous horror movie is called Halloween. What are you people doing?
And that was made 3 times with the same title.
Yeah. Anyways, the 2 Thanksgiving episodes they made, one was called Flesh and Blood, and one was called Pilgrim. That was the one that was discussed in the article I read. But not enough good Thanksgiving movies out there, but I've learned about enough that I feel like you could watch 2 or 3 different ones every year and be set for, I don't know, maybe not a whole decade, but several years. But I think you're probably right that the most famous of them, the most canonical of them, besides maybe the Peanuts short, I feel like at this point, if there's a holiday, you assume there's an associated Peanuts short. And the 2 best are Christmas and Great Pumpkin from fall, Halloween. but this is certainly a well-known Thanksgiving movie. And now I want to talk a little bit about some of the talent involved here. So first, director, writer, John Hughes. So Brian, I'm going to check now. This is where I will shout out that Letterboxd introduced a new feature that is list stats. Have you played around with this, Brian?
So I literally just saw this button like 10 minutes ago because I made a list recently. I was looking back at the list and it says new stats, but I don't know what it does or what it could possibly add to my life. But what does the stats button do, Dan?
Oh, Brian, you're underselling its value. It brings a lot of value, I would say. No, what it does is it takes like a list. So in this case, the list I'm referring to is you maintain a Letterboxd list of all of the movies that we discuss. And it shows you various stats about them, some of which we do on our own, like what is the most recurrent year, but other stuff that we couldn't do on our own, like which actors appear the most often across our films. And not only that, but you can actually filter by various things. So I was able to look up, for example, what Steve Martin movies have we actually watched and discussed, and found out that, hey, this is the third. And it allows you to do stuff like that. So I feel like it's going to enhance our discussion of what we've previously discussed. Not that really anybody is keeping encyclopedic knowledge, cross-referencing past episodes or anything like that. But I still like to know, like, when have we talked about this actor? When have we talked about this director?
Yeah, I just clicked the button, and you're right, it's more impressive than I thought it was going to be. I figured I would just click it, and it would tell me how many people had looked at the list, and that it would just be me looking at it every other day, and one. Not very useful, but this is kind of cool. I like that you can, it tells us how many films from each year. Right now we've got 4 years where we have covered 9 things from that year.
There you go. I think you can only access it if you're a pro or a patron, and I gifted you a pro, so you're able to access it. But
yeah, I've never seen a website like that before where you can just gift the higher status to someone, and I didn't even have to consent to it. It was just like you dubbed me, you've knighted me.
Yeah, that's the weird thing, is it's not like I sent you a claim code or anything like that. I just typed in your username and clicked the pay button, and it's like, oh, he's pro now. Like I don't even think you get a notification, It's just like you log in one day and you have pro. I gifted it to my sister, and I didn't tell her. I figured she would get a notification because this was the first time I had given it to someone. And later I said, so did you like that I gave you pro? And she's like, oh my gosh, that's how I got it. I was so worried my credit card was going to get charged because she didn't know why all of a sudden she had pro on her account. It's kind of funny.
Yeah. The best thing is it lets you clone lists. That's my favorite thing.
Yeah, that is useful. But the reason that I bring it up is I wanted to look up to see if we had discussed any other John Hughes films. I could only think of one that he wrote. I wasn't sure if there was any that he directed with that we had seen. So we did talk about one that he wrote, and that was way back near the start of the pod, Some Kind of Wonderful, which is a romantic comedy drama from actually the same year, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. And directed by Howard Deutsch rather than John Hughes, but he wrote it. That's crazy that it was the same year, actually. Not as Planes, Trains, and Automobiles.
I was looking at his list, and he did a lot of movies, obviously. He's kind of like the quintessential 80s director.
So that's what I was going to say is, cinephiles tend not to be crazy about John Hughes. His scripts are imperfect. And he's not a very artistically ambitious. He's not an art film director by any stretch, He just kind of makes comedies with characters and in a very specific flavor. But I would say, even though he's not showing up on like Sight and Sound polls, he is probably one of the most influential directors of the 80s. And as you said, one of the most quintessential directors of the 80s. he made, of course, teen movies that just reshaped the way that we made teen movies in Hollywood. Breakfast Club is the most famous, but he wrote Pretty in Pink, did 16 Candles, and a couple others. But he made other comedies too. He wrote Home Alone. He obviously directed Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. He did Ferris Bueller. So he was very prolific and also kind of like an idiosyncratic guy in person. He was very reclusive. He didn't interact with the press too much. So he's kind of an enigma. And then he passed away relatively young, like in the 2000s, I think, or 2010s, early 2010s. But someday I kind of want to talk about like how he reshaped teen movies, because the more teen movies I watched before and after Breakfast Club, the more I realized Breakfast Club was like an inflection point on teen drama in American cinema, for better and worse. You know, we're all still kind of reacting to that the same way gangster movies are still reacting to The Godfather, and World War II movies are reacting to Saving Private Ryan. Just kind of changed the way that people looked at the genre. But today we're not talking about a teen movie. We're talking about a road trip comedy about two adults, not teens.
I did notice some beats similar to Ferris Bueller. Like, it's when characters would be running along and there'd be like funky music playing.
Yeah. Yeah, that kind of thing is definitely a John Hughes thing, like the 80s pop from the charts at the time, needle drop, as there's some sort of chase scene or action type scene or comic mischief on screen, you know?
And Ferris Bueller was the year after this one.
Gotcha, yeah. And the talent involved, I mean, it's a two-hander. You know, it's entirely built around this dynamic duo, this odd couple, if you will. And that is Steve Martin and John Candy. So, Brian, without looking it up, can you think of any other Steve Martin films that we have watched and discussed for this podcast?
Yeah, so there's been a couple. He was front and center in Parenthood. Also prominent, we watched Little Shop of Horrors, which had John Candy as well in a bit part.
That's right, yeah.
Was there anything else?
No. According to our Letterboxd stats, I can now say with relative confidence that is the only two times that we've seen Steve Martin. But we did talk quite a bit about him in the Parenthood episode. And I think we talked a little bit about then how he's kind of always looked like he's 50. Like basically from when he's 30 to today, he's always looked like he's 50, you know? Because of that hair that got gray so young.
Right.
I was also, I watched the SNL behind the scenes movie from this year called Saturday Night, which I wasn't too crazy about. I thought it was a little too chaotic, but had some good stuff and had me thinking about Saturday Night Live. And I went and I rewatched a couple of Steve Martin sketches. But the one that I was thinking about is have you ever seen him do his King Tut song? It's pretty good.
Yes. Very silly, but I like the production design.
Yeah, and he's just got like a weird energy. It's like, I don't know. He always seems kind of normal because he often plays the straight man. But, and I want to talk a little bit about that for this movie. But I was like, okay, I get it now. Like that was the moment it clicked for me. Like, okay, he's just like an organically very funny and charismatic guy, even when he's not like playing the fuddy-duddy straight man, you know?
It says the top 3 themes that we cover on this podcast are: number 1, crude humor and satire. Number 2, gags, jokes, and slapstick humor. 3, horror and the undead.
Feels about right.
Yeah, I guess so.
We needed something a little more Dancore in there, I think, but we're not too far off. And then the other one here is John Candy. So we might have mentioned John Candy when we talked about Little Shop. I can't remember. We certainly didn't talk about him very much. R.I.P. John Candy. John Candy passed away young. He was like 49 or something like that. And pretty much everybody loves John Candy. Movie fans love John Candy. He's very funny. kind of just epitomized the archetype of like the jolly big fella, you know, a prototype of sort. Chris Farley would kind of bring a sort of manic version of this to the forefront not too much later.
Yeah, I get him mixed up with Chris Farley, who also died young, and there's like movies that were in the pipeline, and oh, did you know they started recording this with, and you could say John Candy or you could say Chris Farley, and there would be examples for both, but I'm not sure which is which. Like John Candy, I think, was going to be a turkey in Disney's Pocahontas, but I believe it was Chris Farley who was originally slated to be Shrek.
Yes. Yep, that was the one I was going to bring up. That's the famous one. So, John Candy died young. He died of a heart attack, although it must be stressful to be a big-time actor. There's plenty of movies about how hard it is to make movies. We had dedicated a whole month to it, you know. It was really a jumbo double month. We talked about like 25 things across 2 months. But also, he was fat and he drank a lot and he smoked a lot. You see him smoking a lot even in this movie. And apparently he binge ate when he was stressed out. So that's kind of stuff's not good for your body. But Chris Farley died of a drug overdose.
That kind of stuff's not good for your body either.
Yeah, that'll do it too. And apparently John Candy probably did some drugs too. But, you know, I think a lot of people in Hollywood in the 80s were putting one or two things up their nose. But John Candy, pretty widely beloved, like I said, by movie fans, but also like he's one of those people where everybody who interacted with him fondly remembered him. And I think that's important for this movie because in some sense we're getting a sort of authentic John Candy here. Someone who, like, in spite of everything, there's still an affection there. There's still a reason that you're drawn to this person and you kind of care for them. And Roger Ebert actually wrote about this. He did an essay on planes, trains, and automobiles for his Great Movies column. I didn't get a chance to revisit it this week. I wanted to, but I ran out of time. But I remember him talking about that as like, this is kind of, you use the term quintessential to talk about John Hughes. This is the quintessential John Candy movie. This is like the essence of what John Candy was in this film. Now, he did a lot of other stuff, and he was funny and all that too. But I don't know. When I think of John Candy, I think of planes, trains, and automobiles and the big personality and presence that he has here. So I'm glad that we're doing a John Candy vehicle because he's someone I feel warmly towards. Brian, had you seen Planes, Trains, and Automobiles prior to this past week?
Yes, I'd seen it once. I had heard about it plenty of times, but maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I caught it on TV and thought it's finally time that I watch this. And I watched it with my brother, and I've mentioned on the podcast before, but his response was, "Oh, this is like Due Date," which is a movie that fewer people know, but it is pretty clearly like copying the beats of Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. But in that one, it's a pairing of Robert Downey Jr. in the tightwad role and Zach Galifianakis as the large, obnoxious man.
Oh, yeah, I can definitely see that.
And the guy, RDJ, is trying to get home because it's the impending birth of his child.
Gotcha. Yeah, that kind of makes sense. I mean, to some extent, this is a whole subgenre of movie, you know, like the road trip that goes badly.
Right. Troubled road excursion. I was thinking of Little Miss Sunshine watching it this time.
Oh, man, I love Little Miss Sunshine so much. That would be a fun one to talk about. But, yeah, I didn't even think of that, but there's definitely some of that here, too. I had seen this probably 2 or 3 times before. Maybe more than that. It's kind of like a movie that just feels like it belongs on cable TV, you know? And, like, with commercial breaks in there. I don't know. It's a movie that I could just see myself flipping channels and here's the scene where he takes off his stinky socks and like, oh, I guess this is what I'm doing for the next hour, you know?
Right, and sure enough, that's how I ended up encountering it.
So I think I'm ready to dive into the movie. I want to talk about some of my favorite beats. This is going to be an episode where it's going to be, that thing was funny for me a lot, but we'll talk about some of the other stuff going on here too. So you ready to dive in, Brian?
I'm ready.
So Steve Martin plays Neil Page. He's a marketing executive, and he is trying to get home in time for Thanksgiving. So we kind of infer pretty quickly that he's sort of a yuppie type. He's a career-focused guy. He travels a lot. When he calls home, we see his family. So he's got like a stereotypical golden American family. Beautiful wife, 3 kids. And when he calls home, the young, precocious daughter is like, his flight's delayed. Like, she immediately knows. That's how you get the sense that he's probably traveling too much. It's kind of an elegant way of being like, yeah, he's not home quite enough as much as he should be. But he is trying to make the 6 o'clock flight. He's in New York, going to his home in the suburbs of Chicago. So that's his destination. He's trying to get to the suburbs of Chicago. And we learn it's Tuesday. So he's trying to get home the evening of 2 days before Thanksgiving. And so even I'm already laughing in this very first scene. We haven't even started the road trip, and I'm already laughing. So he's in this board meeting with this director, and they've just made a pitch on some advertising something or other. And this guy, Steve Martin is like glancing anxiously at his plane ticket, 6 o'clock, got to get out of here. And this guy just keeps looking at what's in front of him, looking up, taking a breath as if he's about to speak, and then pausing again and looking down at it. And it drags on longer than I would have expected it to. And I just kept laughing more and more as this built here. It's not even that like the meeting is long and boring and the guy's saying boring stuff. He's literally not saying anything. And Steve Martin's waiting for him to say something. But at last he gets out of the meeting and his coworker's like, oh, you should just take the 8 o'clock. Forget the 6 o'clock. And Steve Martin's like, no, I just want to get home. If I leave now, I'll be home by 9, which I was thinking about that. I was like, I guess, is that even feasible? I guess if it's like a 2 to 2.5 hour ride.
Yeah, I would guess a flight New York to Chicago is around about 2 hours. The place that I've flown most frequently is from Virginia to the West Coast, and that takes like 5 hours. I've flown to Florida from here. That takes about an hour. I've flown to New York from here. That takes about an hour. So, I would guess probably around about 2 hours.
All right, I'm going to plug this in real quick. Here we go. New York to Chicago. Show flights. If I were to leave on a Tuesday, yeah. Well, let's see. No, it's 2 hours and 40 minutes. So it looks like a little under 2 hours, but it's actually a little under 3 hours because the clock changes. But you know what? That gives it to him.
Oh, a different time zone. That'll get you.
Yeah.
That's what Jules Verne taught us.
That's right. So if he makes the 6 o'clock in New York, and then he'll be back by a little after 8 on Chicago time. And that gives him about 45 minutes to get home. So honestly, that sounds about right now that I think about it. It was the hour that was throwing me off there because the time change. What was it about Jules Verne and time zones?
It was actually the international dateline. That's how Phileas Fogg makes it around the world under 80 days. He thinks he's done for, but then he's like, wait a minute. I just need to cross the international dateline. And it gives him an extra day.
Ah, there you go. So then he gets out of the building trying to get to the airport. And we have our first chase scene-esque, like physical comedy bit, of which there will be many, many. And it's Steve Martin trying to catch a taxi in rush hour. And he tries to flag down one taxi, and this other guy's trying to flag it down too, and they're running after it. And I assume you recognized who the other person going after the taxi was, Brian.
Yeah, it was Kevin Bacon. This time I just kept seeing faces. It's like, wait a minute, I know that person.
Yeah, it's a pretty young Kevin Bacon. He just appears for this one scene, but they kind of have this extended duel for this cab, and Steve Martin trips over this big trunk. He doesn't make it. Kevin Bacon gets it. Then there's another cab he's trying to get. He like negotiates with this guy to take the cab so he can make the flight in time, and the guy like makes him pay $75 to take the cab. And then as he's doing that, somebody else takes the cab. And we see in the trunk of the taxi that the big traveling trunk that he had tripped over to miss the first cab was in the back seat of the taxi now. And Steve Martin angrily chases it down. Like this is that scene from Terminator or whatever it is, Terminator 2, where T-1000 is chasing down the car. Is that what it is, Brian? Is a T-1000 chasing down a car in Terminator 2?
I think so. The version I remember is they did a take on it on The Simpsons.
That's what I was thinking of too, actually, yeah. But he sees in the car John Candy. So John Candy not only made him miss the first taxi by putting his luggage in the way that Steve Martin tripped over, but then he stole the next taxi. And now we smash cut to the airport, and sure enough, his flight has been delayed. He made it just in time, and then his flight is delayed. So now he's sitting here waiting. What's going on? Well, it turns out there's bad weather. The bad weather is what's causing it to be delayed. And Steve Martin sits down in the terminal, trying to wait for what's going to happen next. And who does he sit across from but John Candy, of course, this guy named Dell. And I really like the way that they meet is Dell's like, I know you from somewhere, and just starts chatting with him. And Steve Martin immediately recognizes him as the guy who took the taxi. And he's like, yeah, you took my taxi. And I don't know, just like you immediately get a sense of the dynamic here. First is that Dell is very gregarious. This is the John Candy character. He's very friendly, very talkative, and he bears no grudges. He's just a warm fella. He's bringing you into his circle, but he's annoying. He's always getting under your skin. He's talking more than he should, and he's saying something that's just going to rub you the wrong way a little bit, even though he's trying to be nice. And Steve Martin is very standoffish. And Brian, one of my axioms of comedy is that there's nothing funnier than a good straight man. And Steve Martin really sells being a straight man throughout this film because it makes everything funnier if you have someone who's good at getting annoyed, getting flustered, having the bad and crazy things happen to them. You know, you need an anchor in the chaos in a movie like this. And I think Steve Martin does a great job of it. And as I already mentioned, I think John Candy does a terrific job of being that kind of high wire energy that keeps things flying off the rails constantly throughout this film.
Yeah, it's pretty common that you see the dynamic between an uptight person and like a larger-than-life person. I think of it as Bert and Ernie, but you get the same thing with like Abbott and Costello, and many different permutations of that. And it can be a hard balance to strike, I think, to get it right. One of my favorites that does this is Weekend at Bernie's, which I think we're going to have to cover some week. I really think that does a good job of having the uptight person still be likable. I don't think I really like Steve Martin in this movie.
No, he's cold. He's icy. And maybe that's a flaw. I don't know.
I like Bert.
Right.
Bert's one of my favorite Muppets.
I like describing the dynamic as Bert versus Ernie. That's the odd couple thing. Yeah. That's something we can maybe think a little bit about and talk about as we go is I empathized with Steve Martin, but I didn't like him. I didn't want to be friends with him, you know?
Yesterday I was listening back to our Greatest Showman episode, and in that you had a moment when you said, well, I don't want to hang out with a clown every day.
Just some days? Is that, I don't know. I guess that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, that was my response. Maybe every other day.
And at last they managed to get on the plane after the delay. And Steve Martin is apparently supposed to have first class. And he gets into an argument with the stewardess. It's like, I bought first class. Well, your ticket doesn't say first class, but that's what I bought. And eventually he gets seated in coach. And of course, it's next to John Candy. It's next to Del. We're not shaking Del that easy. And I think one thing this movie does that's interesting is it depicts a lot of Del being, despite the fact that he's kind of annoying and that he causes trouble, he manages to solve problems. He has social capital with people. He can be friendly to people and get them to help him out. Whereas Steve Martin has the opposite situation. He's grumpy and people are less inclined to help him. And you just see that over and over again. He's not personable to the people who can help him solve his problem. And so he doesn't get in their good graces, and things go worse for him because of it. And this is the first example of that. So I don't know. I think one thing that's interesting about this, and I want to talk a couple of examples of this, is it probes the characters a little more than a movie like this would need to. And it gives good answers for why these two would continue to be spending time with each other. It doesn't just hand wave it away. It kind of interrogates that dynamic, maybe even too much, I would say. But we can keep going there. This scene on the plane might be the hardest that I laughed throughout the movie. So, of course, Del is just obnoxious. At one point, Steve Martin's even like, sorry, I'm trying to read this, and I'm just not a very conversational kind of guy. And Del's like, oh, I know what you mean. I hate it when somebody just keeps talking and taking over your space. And then, first of all, the way that he's doing that with a lack of awareness is funny. But then he just immediately starts doing obnoxious stuff. And my favorite is he takes off his shoes and he says a phrase that I probably uttered 1,000 times in my life, Brian. He says, whew, my dogs are barking, when he takes off his shoes. And I told Katie, I said, I made my wife watch this with me. And I said, you're going to hear phrases that I say that you didn't know were from this movie. And that was one of the two biggest ones, I would say, is, whew, my dogs are barking. Or I'll sometimes say, these dogs are barking. But I think what Del actually says is, my dogs are barking. And then he like takes off his sock and he's like airing it out and like spinning it. And it's getting right in Steve Martin's face. And it's really obnoxious. And then we smash cut to like the flight, taking longer than expected for reasons that'll become clear in a minute. And both an old man on this other side and Del are like sleeping on Steve Martin's shoulders. And he's just kind of exasperated and pretty good. This whole scene made me laugh a lot.
Had Katie seen it before?
No, she had not seen it before. And she said she doesn't like movies like this because they stress her out. But she did find parts of it quite funny.
One thing that I thought was good was it does keep a pretty clear timetable. Mm-hmm. Like you can keep track of this journey. And I looked it up and people have like made maps.
Oh, interesting. That's pretty cool. Because yeah, what happens is the plane, because of bad weather, I think, gets routed to, what is it, Wichita?
Right, in Kansas.
Yeah. So they not able to land in Chicago. And not just that, but the flight is canceled. They have no easy way to get home. They're calling, and so now Steve Martin is calling around to hotels, trying to find a place to stay. And of course, Del walks up behind him and is like, oh, you stick with me. I can get you in a hotel. And Steve Martin glances at the ground, sees someone who looks kind of like him, uncomfortably curled up, resting his head on a suitcase, and makes a decision that will alter his next few days. And he's like, I'd rather hang out with Del at a hotel than be stuck on trying to fall asleep on a floor overnight like this guy that he's looking at here. But I think you're right. And I think that kind of points to an overall strength of the film, which is that it's very well structured in a lot of ways. The character dynamics, a lot of the jokes are very well structured. Something will happen, and then you'll have to wait a minute and a half, and then you'll get a payoff of that. Even it's not like the boom, boom, here's the setup, here's the punchline. It kind of like layers the jokes on top of each other. I want to talk about that later in the film when they're on the automobiles portion of the title.
Right. There's escalation as well. Like, and just gradual breakdown.
So they get to the hotel where they're going to stay. And first of all, it's like a real, it's not the kind of place that Steve Martin in his professional travels would stay. It's a kind of like rinky-dink hotel. And they get in there as like first of all, it's like he's thinking he's getting his own room, but they only have one room left. So, of course, now Del and Neil have to share a room. And then it's like kind of a tacky room. It's got a vibrating bed and only one bed, too. And Steve Martin is already like on his last nerve. And it just gets worse and worse throughout this evening. First, he does a shower and like the hot water's coming off and on. And he goes to clear his eyes in the sink. And the sink is like brown, dirty water from the socks that Del was cleaning his sweaty, gnarly socks that he had been spinning in his face earlier. And then also, like, apparently he spills beer everywhere. He's smoking. He takes all the towels and like leaves the floor sopping wet. And he's just like a horrible roommate, Brian. And the escalation of this, worse and worse. You're just feeling worse and worse for Steve Martin. But the breaking point, I was just dying laughing at this, is it's like, okay, they're finally relaxed. They're finally going to fall asleep. And if you know comedy, you know that something's going to break the sleep. It's not just going to be as easy as they go to sleep. And what it is that John Candy needs to clear his sinuses. So he starts making this absolutely horrible noise. It's like a... And it just, Steve Martin hops out of bed. And I don't know, I was laughing really hard at this. And then John Candy's muttering to himself too. And this is where we get kind of the first serious look at the actual dynamic of these characters. So Steve Martin has a long and memorable rant about how annoying Del is. There's a couple good things in here. He talks about how Del just talks and talks. He says, not everything's an anecdote. You have to be discerning. And I feel like this is a good turn of phrase I need to include. Not everything's an anecdote. You need to be discerning. Like, you can't just talk and talk and talk. And then he talks about how now that he's suffered spending time with Del, he can handle everything. And the delivery of this rather mean monologue, I think that's very important. That this is a very, very not nice monologue that Steve Martin is doing. And we can kind of sympathize with him at this point, I think, because it really has been a gross and horrible hotel visit. And John Candy has been annoying this whole time. But what the movie does that's kind of interesting is like it kind of frames it on John Candy's face. And you'd expect him to be unfazed, but he's not. He's hurt by Steve Martin being mean. And he gets defensive. He's like, you can try to hurt me. I don't care. I like me for who I am. My wife likes me for who I am. And John Candy just gets this really sad look on his face. And you're like, oh, he went too far. I know you were annoyed, Steve Martin, but you went too far.
This beat comes pretty early in the movie. I was kind of surprised how early we get the blow-up scene.
Yes.
But I guess we got to dig our way back up from that point.
Yeah, so it comes like right around the half-hour mark. So we're about a third of the way in. And this, you're right, this would be like the second to third act rather than first to second act in most movies. But I like it here because, first of all, makes it plausible. Like, why would Steve Martin be putting up with this? If he just never pushed back at all on John Candy, you would start to be like, okay, this dude is this annoying and he's just putting up with it over and over again. And on the flip side, it makes us sympathetic to Del. Now we've turned a corner from seeing him as the obnoxious guy to seeing him as the guy who just wants to be friendly. And so the dynamic has kind of shifted a little bit. And I think it's also important that Steve Martin at this moment, the Neil character, decides, okay, I went too far. Neil is trying to be nice. I guess I will finish my stay here in the hotel room. I'll hang around just a little bit more. So it's the first time we have the inching towards a union between them. But you're right. It also, their relationship needs to build. This kind of sets it at rock bottom from the start. And I also thought it was funny that, like, funny to the point that it gets repetitive. Like 6 times, Steve Martin will try to part ways with Del. Like, I think it probably makes sense for us to travel separately now. He gives them like that line to Del like 5 different times, and every time Del is disappointed. But they, of course, they keep getting drawn back together. So the next morning, they are trying to figure out, okay, what are we going to do now? And they are going to go get a train ticket. We finished planes. There was a plane trip. Now we're on to trains. And then, you know, as I mentioned, we'll get to automobiles. So they buy train tickets, and the train trip is going well at first, but then the train just breaks down. This is really the terrible, horrible, no good, very bad trip for Steve Martin. Just like everything that could go wrong goes wrong, and then some. Like, does that actually happen nowadays where they just stop the train in the middle of the tracks in the countryside and you got to walk to the town that's 1.5 miles away?
Well, I'm glad you queued that up, because the first time I ever took the train was coming back from college in Williamsburg up to the DC area, which is a train trip that normally it would take like 2.5 to 3 hours. But they said like something had happened to the tracks or something, but they had to stop like in the middle of the woods somewhere, like around Richmond, and we were just out there for like 3 additional hours. And so like some of the people were staying on the train up to like New York and Boston, so I guess they eventually got there, but it was really delayed. So this had me thinking of my train memories.
Oh, interesting. So it is something that has sort of happened to you. But I don't know, were people like getting off the train and walking away?
No, we did not do that.
Okay.
I was thinking about how would this be different today. And unlike some things, you know, it wouldn't, I don't think, be too different. Other than you would be texting people and just like, well, this happened.
That's the thing. There's a couple things. So I think you're right that this is different from some comedies of this ilk where like the instant you have a cell phone, all problems are solved. There's a lot of stuff of like they're calling airlines and they're calling hotels. Nowadays, you would just use an app, you know? You would just be searching on the internet or something. That was one thing. And you're right. He wouldn't be like trying to find payphones to call his wife. He would just be texting his wife this whole time. The other thing that really got me was the credit cards. So like the way they talk about credit cards is totally different. They're like, do you have a credit card? Oh yeah, of course I do. I'm like a professional. I got a, what's the one that they keep saying that I was like, I don't know what this brand is.
One of them I think is Diners Club.
Yes, Diners Club. So what is Diners Club? I've never heard of that one before. Is that like an old brand or something?
I've heard of it. I think it used to be big. Obviously, it's not big anymore, but I'm not a Diners Club historian. Other than I had heard of it.
Interesting. And just a lot more, they're paying with cash for stuff. And that ends up becoming a plot point, that their cash gets stolen at one point. Oh, wait, does that happen the first night? I think it is the first night they get their cash stolen. And he said he had $700 in his wallet. I was like, I've never held that much cash in my life. $700 in your wallet? Are you kidding me? That would terrify me everywhere I'm going.
Yeah, that's pretty crazy. I wonder if Gavin could hook us up with a Diners Club historian.
He knows a lot about history. I don't know if Diners Club, if like the history of various credit card brands is in his wheelhouse. You could ask him.
Well, maybe not his, but he's like the Pawn Stars guy, and he'll know somebody. He can bring in an expert.
He'll go read a book. His terrific column, by the way, Sex, Lies, and Videotape, that he writes for alternateending.com. He like reads a book or more for every single one of those. So maybe we could ask him. I'm not going to ask him to read a book about credit card history, but it feels like if the stakes were there, if we're like, hey, we really need to know about the history of Diners Club, I feel like he would be able to figure it out. He's the person I would trust to tell us what is the history of Diners Club. All right, so we were on the trains, and they're on the trains for like 5 minutes. So someone on Letterboxd pointed out the title, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. A lot of planes action in there. The first act is planes. Trains there for like 5 minutes. Does not earn its prominent place in the title. And then the rest of the movie's automobiles. It got listed third. I guess it happens third chronologically. Definitely not the third most important of those three. I'd put it first out of those three methods of transportation and their importance to the plot.
Yeah, and I guess technically they're on one plane and one train and multiple automobiles.
Yeah, there's buses and various cars, taxis. They ride in a truck.
But it tells you more than, say, it happened one night.
That's right. Because the next thing they do is they get on a bus. And buses are more cinematic than I realized, Brian. Whenever there's a scene on a bus, it's pretty much always good. It's not quite as good as a train, but I like the bus as a setting. People don't ride the buses as much as they used to, so you don't see it quite as often. But you mentioned It Happened One Night. That was a bus movie. I think we called that episode The Love Bus when we talked about it.
Yeah, very bus forward. Bus prominently featured. I just watched, for the first time in a long, long time, like since it came out, the movie Rat Race. Have you ever seen Rat Race?
I think I saw it once in like middle school.
Yeah, same.
I remember Cuba Gooding Jr. says vagina at one point.
And when he says that, he's borrowing a uniform from a bus driver. And then
really?
for much of his arc, he's driving a bus.
There you go.
So that was a recent bus film that I watched.
There's one beat on the bus that I really enjoyed, which is, it's actually funny because we talked about people playing music in public spaces when we talked about It Happened One Night. And here it is a music thing where they are singing, and I don't even know what song it was that Steve Martin was singing. Did you recognize the song that he was singing?
No, but I guess that's the point. Nobody knew the song.
Yeah, and everybody turned and looked at him. It's a great shot. And then there's a pause, and then John Candy starts singing the theme from the Flintstones. Flintstones, meet the Flintstones. And everybody starts singing along. And that you just couldn't pick a better like song of the common man than the theme from the Flintstones. It's perfect. And he gets to shout, Yabba Dabba Doo! Speaking of Simpsons beats, one of my all-time favorite Simpsons scenes is when Homer sings a version of the Flintstones theme song about himself. And then the last line is, he's about to hit a chestnut tree. And then he runs his car into a tree, which the fact that he would sing about it before he would process it always tickled me. Now they get to a place, I guess it's an airport or a bus depot or something, where he's going to rent a car to go home. And this is another breaking point for the Steve Martin character. So there's this huge parking lot full of cars, and he's told where his rental car is going to be. It's like the one empty spot. So whatever, the car that they assigned to him has been stolen, or they misassigned it or something. And it's funny because the entire parking lot is full of rental cars. It's just his one spot that's empty. And now he's got to walk all the way back. And this is the moment that really gets him. He like sludges through mud and slush and walks like over highways and falls down, and his hat gets run over by a truck. And finally he gets to the bus depot. And Brian, this is a scene that you messaged me and said that really stuck out to you, because what does he do at the bus depot, or at the rental car depot?
Well, he blows up at the attendant and he says fuck like 50 times. And this is the only scene where that happens. I forget when I watched it on TV how this scene was rendered, but even then it stuck out to me as like there's no profanity the whole rest of the movie. Well, I guess they say shit a couple times when they're like veering on the ice or about to, be in an accident in one of their automobiles. But not a lot of swearing. And then this scene, it just turns it to 11 all of a sudden, and I don't know if I quite get the joke.
I'm kind of with you. I feel like it would work better if this wasn't just like another bad thing that happened. Because every 5 minutes, there's a bad thing that happens. And this is the one that breaks him for whatever reason. I don't know. It felt like everything. Why wasn't it when the train broke down? That is the moment that he lost all control. I don't know. But I guess the gag is that like exactly the juxtaposition of this hasn't been an R-rated movie thus far, and now here are 27 F-bombs in 30 seconds. Because it does stand out. And I kind of feel like it's unearned. I didn't really laugh. It's kind of uncomfortable. But I don't know. The woman is, I think, in Ferris Bueller, the woman who's the car rental attendant.
Yeah, this movie has a lot of like little tiny appearances by people that I recognized. Obviously, Kevin Bacon, a big one. But at one point, the person who is like giving them their keys at the hotel desk is the lawyer in Jurassic Park who gets eaten on the toilet.
Oh man, I didn't recognize him. But I can see it now. I think you're right, yeah.
And like the cop who pulls them over at one point is played by Michael McKean, who was the brother in Better Call Saul that I talked about a couple weeks ago. There's just a lot of people they run into on this journey.
Yeah, I think probably John Hughes reused some of his cast and like kind of helped him get on the map. But I don't know. You're right. It's a pretty solid cast. A lot of good bit roles. You're right. But so Steve Martin now is in a bad place. He gets essentially escorted off the premises and thrown into the street by a bouncer equivalent. And a car is about to run him over. And of course, this is, he'd just been like, all right, I'm going to part ways with you, Dell. Like for the fifth out of 7 times throughout the film at this point. And it's Dell who managed to snag a rental car somehow and almost runs him over. But now we have yet another reason for them to be together. Dell's like, oh, we'll drive to Chicago. I'll drop you off. Which, like, we're not really... One thing that my wife pointed out is we don't know why John Candy is going to Chicago. Why is it so important for him to go to Chicago? He doesn't talk about it. And part of that is going to lead to late revelation about him. Like, it's not like he's going home. I guess Steve Martin thinks that he's going home, but they don't really talk about it, and we don't really see it from his perspective the way we do Steve Martin going home over and over again. But anyways, John Candy's like, yeah, I'll drive you home. We'll drive together. So now they're on this road trip portion, and this is when the mishaps really start to escalate, where it starts to... I mentioned the structure of the comedy. It's this road trip portion where I really felt it like it builds and it builds and it builds and it builds and it gets worse and worse. And there's just a lot of funny stuff. One is the seat. So the passenger seat, it's another thing where it goes on so long that the sheer length of it becomes funny, but he's trying to get his seat straightened in a way that it's comfortable for him. So he's lowering the backrest. He's raising it. He's lowering it. He's raising it. He's lowering it. He's raising it. And it goes on and on and on until Steve Martin loses his cool. That made me laugh. The one that made me laugh so hard is when Dell is driving and Steve Martin has fallen asleep. And he's trying to take his jacket off. And so he's like, do you ever do this, Brian, when you're driving, trying to take your jacket off as you're driving?
Yeah, I do that. Ha ha, I do that.
I do that. But my wife hates it so much when I do this. And I have like this maneuver that I do where I start to pull my arm out a little bit, but because like my jacket's on my other arm and my other hand has to be on the steering wheel, I can't like pull the sleeve down elegantly. So I kind of like shake my whole body and my arm to try to get it to slide off my arm. And then I repeat the maneuver on the other side. And if your driver's doing that, it's kind of, it freaks you out a little bit. And my wife hates it when I do this. And so this was like she said, I'm never going to let you do that, your jacket maneuver again while you're driving after seeing this here, because John Candy's basically doing what I described, except first his one arm gets caught on like a knob, so he can't move his arm. Like the jacket the sleeve is caught on one side, and then it catches on the other side too. And so now he's trying to drive with his knees, trying to get his jacket off. And he's like, all right, could I fix this without waking up Neil? Because he knows Neil will be mad if he wakes up Neil. And he's like jiggling his legs, trying to get it straight. And John Candy's really selling it. And I thought this was terrific.
The editing of this bit is really good, showing how, and the pacing, which is a part of editing, but like the way that it shows, and you can understand the things that he's getting hooked on. And obviously it's outlandish, but like it's within the bounds of feasibility. Yeah. And then the punchline that where it does become ridiculous is he doesn't want to wake up the other guy. Oh, by the way, one of the people who shows up in this movie, Dylan Baker from Trick or Treat.
Oh, yeah. So I saw him in the credits, and I was like, wait, who is he? So who is he in this?
I'm pretty sure he was the hick who shows up at one point, and he's spitting tobacco.
Oh, my gosh, that was him? I remember that. And he does, and there's like 2 or 3 characters who are kind of like this in the movie where you just see him and you know they're bad news.
People that you probably wouldn't want to get in their car.
Exactly. And that's one thing I'll say about this movie. It's a mark against it, is that it's kind of repetitive. Some beats show up a couple times. But yeah, I guess that was Dylan Baker. He's also in Spider-Man, I think. Is that right?
Oh, yeah. He played the Lizard, except they never got to Spider-Man 4, or whenever they would have had him be the Lizard, he never got there. So he's just Peter Parker's teacher, Kurt Connors, and we never see him get his villain arc.
Yeah. Too bad. I feel like, didn't I hear that he was going to maybe make another Spider-Man or something? Or maybe that was another Marvel one. I don't know. I guess they're all merged together because of the multiverse, right?
Yeah, in this age of the multiverse, never say never.
Another good one, gag from this stretch is, I mentioned there are some phrases that I say from this movie, and one is the particular cadence of, "You're going the wrong way!" Because at one point, John Candy inadvertently exits on the wrong side of the road, and the people across the street are trying to let him know you're driving the wrong way down the highway. And John Candy's like, oh, the idiots, they want to race. Actually, they must be drunk. They say we're going the wrong way. And he like does a gesture at them like, you're drunk. And it's so funny.
I liked Steve Martin's response to this. How would they know where we're going?
But I do say, you're going the wrong way a whole bunch whenever somebody's doing something wrong. The opposite way, the non-intuitive way. And then another gag that takes like, kudos to John Hughes for the patience of this, because it takes like 5 minutes for it to pay off, is John Candy smoking a cigarette, tosses out the window, and because of like the air currents, it gets sucked back in the back window, the barely lit cigarette. And we keep waiting. When is the fire going to occur? When is it going to happen? Because we know it's going to happen at some point. And it's finally after they're going the wrong way and they like squeeze between 2 trucks that are going opposite lanes. They made out kind of well, honestly. And like, given that you're driving 60 miles an hour down the wrong side of the road, and oh yeah, as they're doing this, there's like a little bit of goofy effects where they show him as a skeleton and then as a devil when they're like barely surviving this, because they don't actually hit the trucks. They like get caught between 2 of them and sparks are flying out. So it's kind of like a weird, almost surreal moment in this film. But then they survive. They get out. They're like, oh my gosh, that was crazy. And that's when the car catches on fire. It builds and builds and builds, and it comes at the perfect time. I thought that was pretty funny.
Yeah, and I think there's even a line from one of them that like, well, that could have been worse. Something like that. And then it bursts into flames.
Well, the funny thing is that like the car's side is completely battered, and John Candy's like wiping the sleeve of his jacket on that. He's like, you can buff that out. You can buff it out. When it's like completely dented and ruined. That was making me laugh too. So now we're getting to the tail end of the adventures here. The misadventures, as the case may be. Oh, they have to keep driving the car. I don't know how this thing was possibly functioning, because it's like completely burnt through and you can't read any of the meters. There's a funny encounter with a cop where he's like, oh, the funny thing is I don't know what speed I was going because we had a car fire that melted our speedometer, and just delivered with a straight face by John Candy.
Yeah, and the cop, who again is Michael McKean, he says, do you believe this vehicle is roadworthy? He says, yes, officer, I do.
So they're stuck driving around with this, and they get another hotel room, and this time Steve Martin's the one who gets it, and he doesn't let Dell in because he's mad at Dell, because apparently Dell like inadvertently charged it to Neil's credit card due to like a credit card switch up. And this is kind of where they hit another turning point in their relationship, because Neil sees Dell outside and kind of realizes how much Dell has like helped him get through all of this. And they have like a bonding session in the motel that night. They're drinking airplane bottles. Dell is always got little bits of alcohol with them. They're eating Doritos and stuff. And they're kind of just talking about how, boy, this is going to be something we're going to look back on and laugh. And Steve Martin finally starts to warm up. And I was glad to see them actually like enjoying each other's company for a scene here,
Yeah, I liked it. I wanted some of those little bottles. I was kind of wondering where they had come from, but yeah, you're right. It must have been something that Dell had, because in kind of like a Pulp Fiction thing, I don't think we ever see what's in the trunk.
Funny you mentioned that. So I think we're supposed to take it that it's the stuff he sells. So I didn't mention one gag that is a kind of a runner, is that what Dell's job is he sells shower rings, the little rings that hold up the shower curtains. And first of all, this is just a patently absurd thing that you're a salesman for. And that he talks about like, oh, I sold rings back to that guy a couple of years ago. We're old friends. Like, can you imagine caring enough about what the rings are in your shower that you have a relationship with the guy who sold you your shower rings? And they're all just little pieces of plastic. But we do get the sense that he's actually a good salesman, because one time they run out of money, and the way he has to get money back is selling the shower rings. And his idea is he sells them as earrings to people, I think at the airport or something like that. And so you see all these people walking around for the rest of the scene with little tacky pieces of plastic in their ears. And my wife was pointing out, you couldn't really do that because to be an earring, you have to have a really narrow spot to get into your ear where it's pierced. But these shower rings all have like really thick bars because they need to be sturdy. So it doesn't make sense that you could sell it as earrings, but it's still kind of a funny gag.
Yeah, maybe they're clip-ons.
Maybe, yeah.
But you're right. It made me laugh that Dell says these outlandish things about his shower curtain career, and yet they all seem to be true.
Right.
He's like, oh yeah, this guy's we're tight. And then, yeah, that's what happens. Like, the guy at the motel does really like Dell.
Yeah, so it's like over and over again that Dell manages to save the day by making some connection with someone, convincing someone to help him out. And I think it's worth noting that for all of the way that like Dell manages to get into trouble, it's like, oh, driving the car the wrong way, and I don't know, whatever other stuff he does. He's really the one carrying this trip. Steve Martin is worthless. Dell's the one getting cars. Dell's the one figuring out, oh, I know a guy at the hotel who will get us a room, like over and over and over again. But yeah, at last, in their burnt out old car, they make it to Chicago overnight. It's now Thanksgiving morning. That whole thing took about a day and a half, almost 2 days to get through. He hops on the train that'll take him back to his house. This being Steve Martin, says goodbye to John Candy. And John Candy has a sad look on his face. We know he doesn't like partying from Steve Martin, but there's something else here. So multiple times he's referred to his wife, and he's got a picture of his wife. We never see him talk on the phone with his wife. And Steve Martin has like the surprise revelation. Like he revisits those moments and is like, oh my gosh, his wife must not be around anymore in some capacity, which I thought was obvious from the start. I don't know about you, Brian. Did that not immediately register for you?
I didn't know what was going to happen the first time I watched this.
Okay.
But again, like some of the outlandish things that he says turn out to be true. So maybe there is a wife.
Yeah.
But then once the veil is pierced and it comes to light that his stories are not all true, like then where are the chips going to fall? Like, was there ever a wife? Like, if there was, what happened?
Part of what it is he didn't outright lie, except for like a couple of times. And those were kind of like fibs, like, oh, I just mean I haven't been home in a while.
Yeah, that's another thing is he says, I haven't been home in years. So what does that mean?
Well, he explains, he's like, oh, figure of speech, But then, like, I wouldn't say it that way. Haven't been home in years. I don't know. But it turns out that he's been like lying. I guess it's strictly about his personal life. He's been like trying not to make it a sob story, because what it turns out is Del doesn't have a home anymore. I guess he just stays in hotels as part of his traveling sales operation. It doesn't really explain it, but he says, I don't have a home anymore.
Yeah, that's what I figured, is that he must live on the road.
Yeah. And then he says that his wife died several years ago. He gives a number, but his wife has been dead for several years, and he really loved her, but he's got a picture of her. I think, your point that, well, if he was lying about this, what could we take to be true? Because you're right, many outlandish things he says he can actually back up. But here he was lying about that. But I think it's pretty explicitly he was like lying about his personal life to make it be less, to not bring the sadness to Steve Martin, to not dwell on the sadness of his life. But when Steve Martin figures it out, I guess he like takes a train back to the train stop that he was at and finds Del and is like, you should come eat Thanksgiving dinner with me.
That's right. I said there was only one train. I misspoke. There are these trains that he rides forward and back at the end, which is like a subway type train.
That's true.
Whatever they call it might be the L. It's like the public transit in Chicago.
Yeah. I forgot. I was making fun of trains, but you're right. I guess they make a late cameo that maybe bumps him up to title status here in this last leg. But then they finally get home, and I don't think it's actually the Home Alone house, but it's like what you imagine the house. Like this house would be $1.8 million now. It's like a big, almost colonial style suburban house on a very nice street. And he walks to the front door, and his whole family is there. They're all picturesque. He kisses his beautiful wife and is like, everybody, this is my friend, Del. And that's how the movie ends. He introduces Del. So Del is going to stay with them for Thanksgiving dinner. And Steve Martin has let the warmth of John Candy into his life by the end of the film. The chaotic warmth. And has decided that, I think he even says, maybe I should be traveling less. Maybe I should be spending more time with my kids. And I like to think that he would course correct on that too. I'm so glad I don't have a job where I have to travel. My wife and I said that to each other like 10 times throughout the film. Like, isn't it great that I can work from home and I don't have to drive. I don't have to fly out once a week or once a month to various cities or offices and stuff. It would just be such a hassle. Be dealing with this kind of stuff all the time. So,
yeah, I feel like that was a beat, especially in like late 80s, early 90s movies, that you got the protagonist who never sees the family because they're always on business flight. It's like that's in Hook, that's in Fight Club.
Interesting, yeah. Yeah. But I know some people who travel some, but I guess I know one guy who has to travel like once a month or so. But most people I know are like IT. IT, you pretty much never have to travel. You can bring a computer anywhere, you know? But yeah, like I said, I'm glad I don't have to travel. I guess you're a filmmaker, Brian. You have to do some traveling as a filmmaker.
Yeah, but also you're very periodically employed as a filmmaker.
That's true.
It's like when you got gigs, so yeah, you go where the work is, I guess.
But that is Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, Brian. We did it. Thanksgiving movie. Although we don't see Thanksgiving dinner. I guess we see either a vision of the turkey at one point, or maybe we get a clip of it at the end. I can't remember. But I do recall we see a turkey for like a shot. But not too much of the actual dinner, because it stops right before dinner. It stops when he gets home. So any things that we didn't talk about that you want to shout out?
Well, I think it captures the spirit of trying to get home for Thanksgiving. Like, it maybe is the best example of a movie about that concept, and it nails it.
I agree. It's like it really goes bad for him. At every turn, the bad thing happens, you know? And
you know what it's like is the Odyssey.
Oh my gosh. Hold on now. You might be onto something. Is anybody courting Steve Martin's wife?
Yeah, that's true. When he gets back, he doesn't need to kill anybody with an axe.
That would have been an ending.
I'd probably rate it higher if that ended up happening.
Like, you get there at the end and there's an annoying person there, and Steve Martin kills him with an axe. More abrupt than the F-bombs, probably. I'm in on this. I want the alternate ending. Actually, have you ever seen the SNL skit, It's a Wonderful Life alternate ending? It's basically that. It's the gag, is they go and they beat up Potter.
You know, he was asking for it.
It's pretty funny. And part of it is Potter stands up to fight back, and he's like, "You can stand?" And is like the whole time he was just sitting in the wheelchair because he wanted to. It's pretty funny. It's kind of stupidly violent. Like, just like punching they like do a cut so it's like a dummy, not a person anymore, but they're like stomping on the dummy and punching it and throw it around. Anyways, that's a good point. Yeah, and then who would John Candy be? I don't know. I guess there's not really a buddy, a companion.
No, he loses all his shipmates. But also, you know, I've been thinking Christmas Carol, and obviously this is the time of year pretty soon where we talk Christmas Carol, and you got this kind of like not a miser exactly, but like a
curmudgeon.
What do they say? He's got his nose to the grindstone. He's just like he's walled off to the world, and he learns to be warmer, to make the time for his family, and just be a little bit more gregarious. And just that it's this transformation that happens in such a short window of time.
Right.
Because of this journey.
I don't know. Sometimes you go through like an arduous couple of days and you feel in the moment like your vision of the world has changed a little bit. That's happened to me before. Not usually in good circumstances, but sometimes. But I don't know. It also fades a little bit over time, which we've talked about with the Christmas Carol. One scene I didn't mention is John Candy dances to, I think it's the Ray Charles is the singer song, The Mess Around. Anytime anybody's doing like singing along to a song on the radio, I'm in.
And The Mess Around prominently featured in the biopic Ray that we covered a while back.
Oh, was that one in there?
Yep. It's the one where Ahmet Erdogan comes up to him and he's like, "Well, I wrote this song. Maybe you want to try it."
So I liked that. Yeah. My dad really liked this movie. He didn't like the F-bomb scene. He's like, why did they have to do that mean scene? So you're not the only one there. But he really liked this movie. So that makes me a little more fond of this film, too. But yeah, I think I'm pretty much ready to rate. I don't know. What about you, Brian? Anything else you want to throw out there?
I'm ready, Dan. We're pulling into the station.
So Is It Good is our signature section where we each give the movie a rating on our 8-point goodness scale, ranging from very not good, a 1 out of 8, to our masterpiece rating, toward a good, an 8 out of 8. So Brian, is Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, the John Hughes film from 1987, good?
I like this movie. I don't love this movie. I don't vibe with it quite as much as some of the Hughes films that I've seen. Like, this is not quite up to Ferris Bueller for me. But I'm going to give it a pretty strong 5 out of 8, which we call good. I think it works. And again, it doesn't have a whole lot of competition, but it might be the best dedicated Thanksgiving movie. I mean, it works. It makes you, like, I liked John Candy, and I suppose I understood Steve Martin, and it makes you think about your own holiday travels. Like, what would I do in this situation? Oh, I remember the bad trip that I had. Oh, and I've got a trip coming up this year. Who am I going to see? And so it kind of, like, weaves itself into your life a little bit, because it captures this moment that a lot of people go through of the travel.
That's a really good point. Pretty much everybody has bad travel experiences at one point in their life. Pretty much everybody's going to find something to relate to. Now, it's not going to be as bad as what Steve Martin goes through here, but everybody has a little bit of that. And yeah, that's a really good point, is that I think that hooks the movie in a little bit more strongly because of that, because you can relate to at least part of it. Like, when Katie and I were talking about it, we thought of 3 weird travel experiences we had. Like, one time we had something kind of similar to this where a flight got canceled. And so we had to go to a hotel room, but it was going to be hard to find a hotel. So we ended up crashing with 4 other people. Now, they were friends of ours. It wasn't acquaintances, like people we just met during the trip. And then we all rode together in a road trip back to the destination. I think we drove from Charlotte to DC. So I was like, okay, this kind of is something that we've experienced, So, yeah.
What about you? What's the rating?
So my head says that this is a 6. This is a very good movie. My heart says it barely inches into exceptionally good. It probably doesn't quite deserve that. That's what I'm going to give it anyways, just because of all my fondness for it. I think I've talked about all the stuff that works really well. I think the characters are very well defined. I think it does a good job of managing their dynamic and giving it some ebb and flow throughout the film. I do think it gets a little repetitive, but so many of the gags are so funny, and they just don't make comedies like this anymore. They make comedies still, but ones that are this well structured and have good are well made films. It's just well lit and blocked and good props and productions and costumes, and it's edited well and it's got good needle drops. I mean, I guess they probably do make comedies like that a little bit, but I don't know. This feels like a little bit of a lost breed, just a great solid comedy,
Yeah, we've talked a little bit that I think many movies that come out these days have to rely on box office takes from other countries.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really hard for comedies to play across language barriers.
Right. Yeah. So the budget won't show up there for comedies. So it's hard to get big casts. Not that this cast is particularly huge. It really is a two-hander, like I said at the start. But you get a lot of cameos and short bits of talented, funny actors. And it's just it's a pleasant film. And I don't know if it's great movie, but I need to rewatch Ferris Bueller, but I would say this is a contender for Hughes' best. It's not his most important, and it's not his most iconic. His most important is Breakfast Club, and most iconic is probably either Breakfast Club or Ferris Bueller. like just in terms of the ones that people know and people think of. And I guess there is a certain joy and spirit. What's the French phrase for that?
Joie de vivre.
Yeah, to Ferris Bueller. That's not quite here. So maybe that one is better. I don't know. Maybe this is a very good, but I already said exceptionally good. I'm feeling warm towards it, and that's what I'm going to land on. That is Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, Brian. I'm glad that we watched it and talked about it. But as of today, the recording of this, it is December. So what are we going to be doing next week?
Well, we do it every year, Dan. I think it's time that we drag out the Dickens and we talk Christmas Carol yet again. This is already going to be our 5th Christmas season.
Holy moly.
Dedicated listeners will remember that we generally cover a platter of 4 different Christmas Carol adaptations, and there's a lot to choose from. Last year we spoke to a man who had watched more than 100, I think it was like 120 Christmas Carol adaptations. Crazily enough, it sounded like he had done it all in 1 year, which is just bonkers. But we have lots more to pick from, even though we've covered 20 so far here on the podcast. 20 Christmas carols and counting. And I think the mini theme this time around is going to be episodes of television series which use the Christmas Carol structure. Now, I haven't picked quite which 4 I'm going to settle on. I think I'm going to seek some input from Dan. But in the next day or two, we're going to settle on what those are. And when we sit down again, that's what we're going to be doing. Skimming through TV shows, different eras, different styles, different genres, but they all find something in A Christmas Carol.
Cool. One of my favorite annual traditions on the goods. I look forward to it all year. Will we ever run out of things to talk about related to Christmas Carol, Brian? I feel like we've already hit all the things there are to talk about, but I think we'll find fresh things too. I think it'll be fun.
And that's something we'll talk about as well is what are we doing? Why are we doing it? Do we have to keep doing it? And I think it should foster some good discussion.
Alrighty. Well, I'm looking forward to it, Brian. I will see you next week. Thank you, listeners. Have a good one.
Bye. Join us again.